I didn't have a gun. I didn't have even a knife on me.
You got a mushroom knife.
You know what? At that point, I didn't even have my mushroom knife on me. Not that smacking it with a brush would have done much,
Tickled it
but
to death.
oh God.
Hello, and welcome to the Wild Dispatch. I'm Robin, and I'm back to help deliver another basket full of skills and stories from the wild. Today, we have a returning guest. Billy Sprague has managed to drag himself out of the mushroom woods and has kindly agreed to spill his guts on all things mycological in the area where we both live, which is coastal Northern California. So, I am very excited to share some of this information with you. To quote Billy, there's definitely some nugs in there. So, I'll stop talking and let Billy do the walking. On with the show.
Welcome to the Wild Dispatch.
Billy Sprague, welcome back to the Wild Dispatch.
Thanks for having me, brother.
First of all, what's relevant today is that there was a pretty good rainfall this morning, and it actually I look out the window now and it's continuing as we
Yeah,
speak, which
yeah,
I think must be a good sign for what's to come.
it is. Yeah, it's great to get it. We're we're past due. You know, I found I found my first porcini last night driving home in the dark, and it was funny. I was chatting with a buddy. I sent him a picture, a fellow hunter, Chris Watkins, out here. I sent him a picture of a photo I had on my phone from exactly 1 year today, and he sort of asked me to help him on this recon mission last year today or yesterday, to help him find his. He took off his backpack. He's got like a frame pack that with crates on it and stuff like that, that some of the more serious hunters kind of have as a setup.
Yeah.
He took it off and he ended up losing it in the woods. I think it started to get dark, and anyway, he left his pack out there with a bunch of mushrooms in it.
No.
And so he got me on board to help him try to find it, because it was, I mean, when he showed me the zone that he was picking mushrooms, and these were porcinis and chanterelles, and I mean, it was so dense in there. I was like, you're crazy, man. Like, it's just all this manzanitas and just a lot of eyeball poker kind of stuff. So you have to be really careful. He actually wears safety goggles when he hunts in there. And, we were just poking around. He wasn't really tracking himself. So we didn't have that to rely on. He kind of knows this area. He's been in there enough, but it's pretty vast and really dense. You can't see 20 feet beyond where you are, really. So anyway, we're covering ground in there, and eventually I actually did come across his pack. And so I kind of gave him a hoot, and he was coming my way, and he found another part of his pack. And so what we found was that a bear had found his pack with the mushrooms and kind of like went through it and made a little bit of a mess and carried some stuff off a little bit. But my point is that, he had about, 15, 20 porcinis and maybe 5 or 6 pounds of chanterelles at this time last year.
Yeah.
And things are just kind of like starting right now.
Yeah.
So I assume we'll get into a little bit of the timing of things and when to look, but it's not the same every year.
Yeah. It definitely seems like it has a flex. I've got to go back though. So was his backpack in like usable condition again, or was it totaled by this bear?
It was, yeah, he was able to put it back together. It's kind of like, these are just kind of like frame backpacks where the pack is taken off, so you're just using the frame,
Oh,
and then you're
okay.
kind of like uh bungee cords and zip tying crates, like mushroom crates, fruit crates or whatever, to the pack. And you could stack like three or four or more sometimes of.
Yeah.
So it's really handy in getting a lot of mushrooms out of the woods, but not so handy in a situation like that where it's really dense. I think he
Yeah.
changed his game plan to maybe buckets and stuff after that.
Okay. I'm
Hmm.
guessing like all the undergrowth is going to be pulling everything apart all the time. It's going to be hard to keep your gear
Yeah,
in.
it's hard to get through
Yeah.
certain areas when you've got anything. I like to keep everything less broad than my shoulders so I can get through zones.
That's a good plan.
But for open picking, sometimes, especially like morels where it's pretty open, you can just stack those things up and it's not that big of a concern.
So I'm also curious. I mean, I know seasonally there are definitely peaks and troughs in the mushroom hunting season. It seems to me like you are out all the time. Whenever I try and call you, you're usually out in the woods without
Hmm.
signal. I mean, how many days of the year do you think you're out searching for mushrooms?
I mean, it's hard to say. In the winter, quite a bit.
Mm.
When I first started hunting mushrooms, I was out 5 to 7 days a week. Um, when I know mushrooms are out in the winter and things are really fruiting, you just kind of have to hit them hard. I go out almost every day when I know that they're out. Um, and it's just part of like who I am at this point, and I just feel more grounded and more myself when I can get out. I don't even really have to find mushrooms. I just need the activity of just being out and being submersive in nature.
Yeah.
But yeah, all the time, even in the summertime, I'm looking for areas. I think we talked about that a little bit on the last episode. But you know, the bugs get stuff quick. Too much rain can destroy stuff quick. And there's competitors out there. Mostly it's deer and other animals and stuff that can get the bugs, and all that can get to the mushrooms really fast. So it's kind of like strike when the iron is hot. When they're out there, it's like time to put in some extra hours.
Absolutely. So then I'm guessing I'm kind of doing the math the other way, or maths I would say in England. In the summer when it's really died down and everything's dried up,
Hmm.
I mean there are some mushrooms that are out at certain times, aren't there? But
Sure.
obviously you're out much less in the summer, I would assume. Are
I
they?
I am I'm out there less for sure, but I'm still out there. And there's still plenty of mushrooms. I hunt mushrooms 12 months out of the year. There's stuff you can find. There's summer mushrooms. Um, it hasn't been that great of a year for summer chanterelles, but they are out there. I've been picking summer chanterelles now for since August. Um, there's oyster mushrooms can be found 12 months out of the year. There's puffballs, kind of like the summertime. Agaricus augustus, the prince mushroom, choice edible for our area,
Hmm.
pops up usually in June and goes for several months. I found one a couple days ago.
Oh,
So there's plenty of stuff. There's plenty of mushrooms out there all the time. Most people just associate rain and moisture, humidity, and stuff with there being mushrooms out. And, there's definitely way more during that time, but there's plenty of stuff that you can hunt during the quote unquote off season. And a lot of folks just aren't out there at that time poking around looking for stuff. So it's a little bit more peaceful out there in the woods, and it's really enjoyable to find mushrooms during those times
yeah.
when the fridge is a little bit more empty.
Okay, so you've already mentioned a few extra mushrooms there that I'm adding furiously to my list of things that we should talk about today, and we can decide if we have time or not. But yeah, I think it makes sense now for us to kind of dip into the kind of the usual suspects. I guess like the beginning question, and I've got a long list of names of mushrooms here, and I don't know if I've put them in the right order, but I wonder if the way in which we should construct it is probably in a sequential way, because generally, I mean, you've said this to me before, and by all means, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like mushrooms don't always follow the same rules each year. But maybe it would make sense for us to kind of go through the normal general flow as a kind of a normal year goes. Like, what are the things that you're kind of expecting to see in sequence? Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure. So, I guess I'll start by saying nature, Mother Nature does what she wants when she wants. And that's sort of a mantra that I try to pay attention to each season. Um, and sometimes I'll see folks and blogs and different groups online that are kind of arguing with each other when certain mushrooms pop up, the timing, and well, this mushroom comes before this mushroom, and but really the truth of it is just that nature decides when, and there's no real rules to how they roll out. There are some kind of, you know, you some loose ways of knowing when things are going to come, but stuff shifts around all the time. It's one of the things that makes mushroom hunting dynamic, that you can't really, when I first started hunting, I would write down, areas, environments, and dates. And what I
Okay.
found was that immediately that you can't really rely on those dates. It's very loose on the timing, and it just depends on different bumper years for different mushrooms. Sometimes the mycelium just really expels all the fruits that it possibly can in one season. And even if you have the exact matched precipitation the next year, they may not do the same thing.
Hmm.
Um,
Interesting.
and then a lot of it is, the variation in the relative humidity and the amount of rainfall and when that rainfall came down. Sometimes you can get a lot of good rain, but then it warms up, for a handful of days after that, and then it's crispy as heck like a week later.
Hmm.
But you're like, oh man, we just got 2 inches of rain. And then sometimes the weather is cooler, so that moisture kind of sticks around a little bit more. So there's no year is ever the same with the
Yeah.
amount of moisture and humidity and all that kind of stuff. So,
Okay.
and what I might observe here in Mendocino, coastal Mendocino, may look quite different than, say, just north of us in Humboldt or just south of us in Sonoma. So even though it's all Redwood Coast, it changes everywhere.
Hmm.
So they're just really, it's still, I think it's still a good idea to write down dates and when you've come across stuff, because over years you can kind of like track things. And sometimes I don't pay attention to dates. It's more like maybe holidays, like my wife and I have rituals where we go out a lot on like Thanksgiving and Christmas, as we don't really celebrate those holidays, and people aren't really out in the woods those days. They're busy communing and driving and cooking and all that kind of stuff. So I always find those dates like really good days to go out.
Hmm.
And certain mushrooms are kind of associated with the holiday timings on those dates for me. But it can be different every year. um
I like it. Even a festive mushroom. It's good.
yeah, so yeah, usually the rollout, coming out of like spring and summer mushrooms, like the prince mushroom, the summer chanterelles,
Okay.
puffballs, chicken of the woods, stuff like that kind of comes out early. Once we start to get a little bit of rain, and I'm talking like, you know, 2 or 3 like good rainfalls. So we're almost there now. We had a pretty good rain a couple weeks ago, and we had that one this morning or last night. But I really like to have like at least a few good rainfalls. And then one of the first things I start to look for in the forest is there's these really tiny little mushrooms that pop up first. They're called mycena, and it's kind of like a large group of just these really tiny mushrooms that will literally just carpet the forest floor.
Yeah, I think I know the
Uh,
ones you mean.
yeah. And then there's these other like oak leaf loving mushrooms that grow. They're really tiny little black mushrooms that grow on the tan oak leaves here.
Hmm.
And I always like to see those first as well. So you want to see these carpets of mycene and these tiny little mushrooms pop up. Those are the first things that pop up after the rain. And you might get a couple of rains and just not see those mushrooms. It usually is after 3 or 4 decent rains where those pop up. When those pop up, that's my signal that, all right, here we go. Things are going to start rolling out. Um, One of the first mushrooms that pops up will be the porcinis.
Okay.
And they usually like, to get them to pop, they usually like warmer weather. And that's great to get them to come up and start fruiting, but you really want the temps to start cooling off after that so they don't get buggy.
Ah,
Yeah, that's what we saw last year with the porcini season here is they flushed with some warm, wet weather, and then it stayed kind of warm. And even just number ones, like the smaller buttons, you'd pick them. Sometimes they'd still be under the duff as shrumps or little duff muffins, and you'd pop them out, and they'd be just totally bugged out.
that's interesting. So it's like warm to get it going, like a little heat spell with raininess, and then the ideal is for it to then drop cool again, so that to
Right.
keep them in perfect condition.
Yeah, for porcini, indeed. Some
And
other mushrooms like cold snaps to get them going. So it really kind of depends. But if we're slowly rolling out the timeline here, that's what I'd like to see.
okay, yeah, and I think that makes absolute sense. Obviously, jump in if you think this will probably flow around in some different directions. It's the nature of conversation.
Sure.
Okay, so porcini is like kind of the first thing to be looking out for. And I have a bunch of little details here about the things like the nuances of their behavior that maybe we could go through. So you said it's like that warm weather and then like a drop is ideal. The things
Mm-hmm.
other things here I have are stuff like topography, like what kind of terrain do they like, or trees and surrounding trees and vegetation. Is there certain elements, or is it just very general with porcini?
It's pretty dynamic, actually. Um, so I live right on the coast, and that's going to be the first place where the porcini are going to pop, typically.
Okay.
Sometimes they'll pop a little bit. Like right now, they're actually popping a little bit more inland with oak trees, like down in the Sebastopol area. But usually it's kind of like I watch things like kind of creep down the coast. So I'll see stuff up in Washington, up in Oregon, Humboldt, and then here. They kind of slowly crawl down the coast. So you can kind of almost like be ready for them. But of course, the rainfall in all the different zones has a big part of how that happens. So on the coast, and and pretty much in general with the porcini is you're looking for pines,
Okay.
and that's what they like. And if people listening to this, I will one nice little nug of information I'll drop in on top of that is they want oak trees mixed in with those pines.
Hmm.
If you're in a forest that's solely pine, it's going to be, good for like Amanita muscaria, different Cortinarius, Suillus, and you'll be in these forests that, oh man, this looks just so good for porcini. But then if there's no oaks mixed in, they're not there
Hmm.
here in Mendocino. It changes a little bit in both directions, but around here you want to see some oaks in there. And it doesn't have to be big tan oaks. It could be kind of like what we call scrub oaks here, like these smaller oaks that got a little bit smaller leaves and they don't really get bigger than like 15 feet. But I want to see oaks mixed in with the pines. If you have that combination, if a heavy pine forest with the oaks mixed in, you're golden for porcini. And
Nice.
it took me a while to figure that out, and even a lot of locals didn't really haven't picked up on that. I'd get tips sometimes for different areas and woods to go check out, and it would just be solely pine, and it would look good in my mind initially, but then I started, they wouldn't be there, and I'm like, well, why aren't they here? What's missing? And then you go back in your head or physically to these zones that that porcini are popping, that you've done well, and there's always oaks mixed in, always. So that's a really good little tip for folks hunting porcini here in our area. They're not super picky about the soil. They like, it's usually pretty duffy, luckily for us here, which makes for a cleaner pick opposed to like maybe more open ground in the oaks, like I was talking about
Yeah.
down in Sebastopol, where that soil is a bit more sandy and they're a bit dirtier. But porcini are pretty easy to clean up.
I was wondering as well, like, does it matter? Do they like tend to prefer like flatter surfaces, or if it's like steep slopes, or do things like that have an influence on where they might be?
Yes. So now you're starting to kind of talk about what we call like microclimates.
Hmm.
So little small zones or areas where the RH might be higher, the ground might be draining water a little bit slower rate. It could be like a small little, even just like a little dip in the ground, like a little dugout, little ravine, all that kind of stuff. And sometimes, yeah, just like flat. It could be just flat air. They're sort of like mycorrhizal with these pine trees and with the trees in that area.
Yeah.
So they're mostly just working with the tree roots and the substrates uh, in with these trees. So they can be kind of almost everywhere and anywhere. Sometimes they're right next to these big. I tend to look for like the largest, oldest pine trees in the forest and gravitate towards them. Um, just has the mycelium has had a longer time to establish a relationship with a tree that's older
Hmm.
opposed to a tree that's younger. For porcini, different mushrooms, sometimes like morels, like baby little firs and baby little spruce, and they're in with the baby trees. So it really kind of depends, but yeah, they can be kind of all over the place. But I'm always looking for little microclimates, especially when I sit the conditions aren't optimal, like it's not wet everywhere, it's
Hmm.
not humid all the time and everywhere. Then when it's like a little bit more dry and crispy, then I'm kind of focusing in a little bit more on those microclimates and looking specifically for those for flushes.
I've got to ask you. You mentioned something when we were talking about slopes there about RH. What does RH mean?
RH is relative humidity. So
Ah.
mushrooms love that. So sometimes the ground doesn't necessarily have to be saturated. If it's humid enough, the mushrooms will thrive in that sort of humidity. And that's one of the reasons why it's so plentiful here on the coast, is because we have this fog that comes in during the day, at night, and it just drives that RH through the roof.
Yes.
And there's things like fog drip too, which is definitely a thing. But I think most of the time when people are talking fog drip, it's more the RH that's having the real playing factor. And because a lot of these canopies here are really really thick. So, and the fog does accumulate on pine needles and all that kind of stuff, but it takes a while for that to happen on these trees. Then it has to drop down, and then the duff is super dense, so it takes a while for that quote unquote fog drip to penetrate that duff. But if the RH is through the roof, then it's high everywhere. It's high in the duff. It's high when these mushrooms are broaching the surface and trying to get out, and it really plays into the fruiting factor.
I mean, it makes absolute sense. I've got two little more questions for you about this, about
Hmm.
porcini. Um, are there any? I mean, maybe you mentioned this before, but are there other like indicator mushrooms? But I mean, it sounds like if porcini are the first mushrooms to come up, then there probably aren't indicator mushrooms before it. Maybe dejuicing, but are there any like mushrooms that give away clues as to the presence of porcini in the future?
Yeah, that's a great question specifically for porcini because there is a mushroom called the spy that is an indicator mushroom. It's kind of a white, milky gray kind of cap. It's got these gills that are kind of decurrent. They kind of like go down the stipe. The mushroom has another nickname for the spy is I forget the Latin name for it. It's a tongue twister. I always just call it the spy. Some people call it shortbread mushroom. And it actually is an edible mushroom, but I've never tried to eat it. It's got the stipe is kind of has like a cucumbery sort of scent to it, and also does have like a sweeter kind of shortbread nose too, mostly on the cap.
Hmm.
So I'll look, I out and it's that's a it's white mushroom. The caps get like 3, 4, 5 inches sometimes, somewhere in that range. So it's easier to see that mushroom in the woods than porcini sometimes that have that sort of muted brown bun kind of color to it.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
So they'll pop a little bit more proud and then um, usually within, and a lot of times they're at the same time too. So you'll find that mushroom and then you'll look around it within 5, 6 feet and you'll also find porcinis.
Yeah.
It's a good way to spot like really young buttons of porcinis too, because that the spy will kind of come and it'll come, it'll go, and it's like 2 weeks after you find that spy mushroom or so. Week or two is when
Mm.
the porcini will be in that exact same zone. I think, there's some little bit of research on that, I think. And, I think there's some kind of symbiotic relationship between the spy and the mycelium with the porcini. And there's some kind of relation there happening indeed. So that is the mushroom that you want to be looking out for. And, so if you're looking in an area, oh, this looks good for porcini, and you see that mushroom, it's good for porcini, and
Nice.
to look in that exact area.
Yeah. Give immediate attention.
Hmm.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. I'm gonna keep my eyes looking out for the spy mushroom now. It also has a good name.
Yeah, that's cool.
um, so the only other thing I was wondering about is, so say you've done your due diligence, you've kept an eye out, you saw the spy mushroom, and you're in the perfect location. Everything is pointing towards porcini being there. You come back 10 days, 2 weeks later, and bam, you see a porcini celebration.
Hmm.
At that moment, then you were telling me before that often there are kind of veins of fruiting mushrooms along the mycelium of mushrooms. Is that something like, do they have specific shapes or directions that you should kind of be looking for?
Certain mushrooms do for
Okay.
sure. And it's kind of just like the way that the mycelium is growing. There's they call them fairy rings a lot of times for certain mushrooms where I'm sure you've tried in science class maybe when you were a kid or whatever where you grow something on a petri dish and you set whatever in the middle of the dish and then it kind of expands out and almost sometimes like this perfect circle. So if you can imagine the mycelium sort of growing that same way in that circle, and then when it puts out its fruits, it's at the outer margins of that circle, and so that's where you'll see what looks like a ring of mushrooms or a fairy ring of mushrooms. And there's certain mushrooms that tend to do. There's even a mushroom called the fairy ring mushroom as a lay name that does that all the time.
Hmm.
Certain mushrooms do that. Sometimes it's rare, sometimes it's kind of sporadic. I found myself in a fairy ring of lobster mushrooms this season, which seems a little odd to me because they're more sort of solitary and spotted here and there. And the porcini kind of fall in that zone too. It's you can find a porcini fairy ring for sure, but it's kind of rare. They're more solitary or in groups and kind of scattered on the ground typically. When I find a porcini, I usually am not looking for a vein of them like I would be for, like, say, chanterelles.
Hmm.
Um, it's like, okay, I know the porcini are here in the area, and then you're just kind of you're looking for, um, shrumps and just it's going to be a more sporadic find for the porcini.
So I wonder. That seems like a good moment. I think maybe you suggested this, but I might be wrong. What's the kind of next flow of mushrooms, like the next in line generally as a kind of loose
So,
structure?
yeah, so shortly after porcinis, you could probably expect to, around the same time, you can expect to find maybe like candy caps will be
Okay,
around, and they like pretty much the same thing that porcinis do.
okay,
So, if you've got a good candy cap spot, it's probably also a good porcini spot, and vice versa. They like the pines and they like the oaks as well. And it's interesting, some seasons they'll favor the pines, and then the next season they'll favor the oaks. So it's kind of one of the fun things I like to figure out early in a season is, okay, what trees are they kind of like in with harder this year? And then I'll pick the different zones that I hunt based on prior experiences of there being a little bit heavier oaks in this area or a little bit heavier pines, just based on what they're favoring. And sometimes it'll be initially they're favoring the pines, and then later in the season they're favoring the oaks. So they'll kind of almost have like a second kind of a flush
that's
with
so
different
curious.
trees. Yeah, so candy caps will be around, usually around then or shortly after. You'll start seeing both hedgehogs and yellowfoot.
Yes.
And those mushrooms also kind of like the same sort of scenario. So with
Okay.
those mushrooms, you might be shifting a little bit. They like pines, mixed conifers. More, they like more of a mixed forest than the porcinis and candy caps. They like huckleberries as the understory brush, maybe some salal in there too, but for sure huckleberries. The hedgehogs love the huckleberries.
Yeah, I've noticed that before.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, for sure.
And yeah, the yellowfoot will usually be somewhere nearby. The yellowfoot will probably be favoring a little bit um wetter situations, like a little bit more boggy. Like, I usually find just amazing flushes and like poor drainage soil.
Hmm.
And both those mushrooms also like decaying stumps and logs, and sometimes a lot of just like rotting branches and debris and stuff. They really like that, especially the old stumps. They just go crazy around those things.
And I'm curious. So Yellowfoot, I think I only ever found one. And at the
Okay.
time, I didn't know what it was, but I thought this looks cool if I'm thinking of the right thing.
Uh-huh.
But how much time? So you're saying hedgehogs and Yellowfoot kind of have a bit of a symbiotic relationship in terms of timing
Timing, yeah.
compared
Mhm.
to the others. Roughly how much time, say, Porcini and Candy Caps have kind of done their thing, and are they like moving away now? Is this just like a matter of like weeks or like a month or two after those guys have gone away that the Yellowfoot and the Hedgehog start coming up? Or I mean, of course,
It
it varies.
Yeah, it completely varies, and you could find all those mushrooms at the exact same time. They'll all, I can think of one forest right now that I could walk into at the right timing, and I'll find all those. I'll find candy caps, porcini, yellowfoot, hedgehogs, all in the general same area at the same time. So there's a lot of overlap, and the timings do shift around. So yeah, you can say weeks. You can even say months to answer that question. Um, again, it's just like what nature decides to do. But it's interesting you say you found one yellowfoot because usually when that mushroom flushes, it's in large numbers, large troops. So it's pretty rare to just find one yellowfoot. If you find one, there's usually a bunch nearby. Same with the hedgehogs, sort of, especially the small belly button hedgehogs, the larger hidden number pandums, the sweet tooth will be a lot more sporadic and not really in big flushing numbers like the belly buttons.
Yes. Okay, no, I realize I'm making a mistake with my my claim now because
Okay.
I have found a bunch of yellowfoot before, and that you are absolutely right. Like, so I was thinking of a different mushroom.
Do you remember what mushroom you were thinking of?
Oh, okay. So now we're going to get into, yeah, let's give it a go. So it was very yellow, and kind of a weird looking mushroom, bright yellow. That how would I describe this in an audio sense? Imagine like a quite a thick stalk, stubby, going up into almost like a stump top. And no, I don't even think that there was an underside to this mushroom. It was just almost like coral, if that makes sense. So I'll have
Hmm.
to look it up, and I'll make a reference to this at
It could
the
have
end of the.
been some sort of Brommeria, some kind of coral. There's also what they call like club fungus that will
Okay.
just there'll be it does look like a kind of like a caveman club.
Yes, exactly like
And
that.
it would be, and there are some that are yellow. There's it's actually another like quote unquote dessert mushroom that's in our area besides candy caps is this yellow club
Mm.
mushroom that sounds like kind of what you're describing. Sometimes it'll be a little bit flat on the top
Yes, it
too.
was exactly that.
Okay, that's probably what you found, and that is usually a solitary mushroom too, like you described. And that's actually a mushroom that you can uh, eat raw too, which it
Ah,
took me a few years to figure that out. Christian Schwartz from Mushrooms of the Redwood Coast, we were hunting together once, and we found some, and he told me that, and I tried it, and man, just like really sweet, delicious little mushroom. I love finding them. The bugs like them too, though, so the timing's got to be quite right. But that is actually a cool find that you had, if that's what it was.
that was my problem, definitely, because I took it home. Obviously, I didn't know what it was at first, and then I discovered it was edible, but it was, yeah, it was riddled with bugs. I think
A
by the
little
time
too
I,
late. Uh-huh.
yeah, but it was also on like a super steep slope. At that point, it was like almost cliffy, kind of off of a trail. I just saw it bright yellow in the distance and managed to scramble my way up a really steep section to get to it.
Nice.
But anyway, we digress from these are not the usual that is not the usual suspect of
No, not
mushrooms
really.
around
I'm
here.
I'm lucky if I find two or three of those a year.
Yeah, cool. Well, that's awesome. So then, okay, so we got through Yellowfoot and Candy Cap. So what's the kind of next common kind of phase?
Um, so then maybe we're starting if we're segueing out of Yellowfoot and hedgehogs, then we're probably starting to encroach on black trumpet timing.
Okay.
They like a little bit later in the winter, and the last couple of years have just been amazing for black trumpets. But we had a couple really weak seasons before that. So I'm always really thankful when we have sort of a banner year for any one mushroom, and because you can't really rely on it just being a treasure trove every year. But the last couple of years for black trumpets have been great. And that mushroom, if the conditions are right, can be around for a long time. Like, you know, they maybe people start finding them, and maybe January, February. Um, it's a slow growing mushroom, and I think a lot of people get excited about the arrival of that mushroom and they pick them too young. Like if they're just 2, 3, maybe even 4, like 4 inches, I would just leave them, just let them go. Take the risk of you somebody else finding them, or because they really just need to drop spores, and that mushroom could get so much bigger than 3 or 4 inches.
Oh, really?
So if you're picking them that young, let's say you find a spot that's pretty remote, or you know how to get back to it, just mark the spot and just go back to it in a few more weeks, maybe even longer. I've had some of my best trumpet hunting in early March. And this last year, things went in well into April, which
Really?
seems like pretty late, but they were just had a really, really long, great season last year. So, but they like sort of that colder weather too to kind of get them going, and they like rain at the right time. They kind of like rain like, uh, you know, a few weeks before their arrival. Sometimes when people expect to see them in like late December, January, and we haven't had the rain, they just won't. Even if we get the rain like a little bit later, they just won't do their thing. Um,
So like a really big dump of rain, I'm guessing, from the
yeah, they
times of
like a
year.
lot of rain. And then if we get into the terrain of that mushroom,
Hmm.
my first year hunting, I was pretty avid, like I mentioned. I went out quite a bit and I found a lot of mushrooms that first year. It was a really rainy year, but one mushroom I did not find was the black trumpet. And I was kind of scratching my head about it initially as a newbie, why I wasn't finding this mushroom. And then I realized that I wasn't going inland enough. I wasn't getting in. I was getting in with tan oaks, but not a lot of tan oaks, and that's what you really want with the black trumpets is a lot of tan oaks. They will flush closer to the coast in that same kind of environment, but we don't have that too much here, um, around the Fort Bragg area of Mendocino. I was going down, you'd have to go down to more like Point Arena area where that habitat is a bit closer to the coast.
Hmm.
Um, there's also a little bit of variety in the quality between the more coastal black trumpets and the inland trumpets. The inland seem to get thicker walled uh, uh, species. Um, so yeah, you'll heavier mushrooms, bigger mushrooms, and really thick walls, and they almost look like they're stacked, like layered 2 or 3 different layers. I like the coastal varieties because I like that lighter, kind of fluffier texture to them. I kind of prefer those as like a fresh mushroom.
Yeah.
But the inland ones will get thicker. So the inland, or the ones that are, the black trumpets like these thick tan oak stands. They like a really sandy, kind of gritty soil, and they're also partial to heavy slopes.
Yes.
So that can
Okay.
be a mushroom that's like not really too friendly for like older folks, or can be pretty kind of dangerous hunting black trumpets. A lot of times I'm literally sliding down the hill as I'm picking them and putting them in my basket, and sometimes my basket or whatever at my bag usually is just like wants to roll down the hill. I've had to like reach for it a handful of times. So they like that slope. They like that sandy soil. They like the tan oaks. Maybe there's madrone mixed in, or manzanita mixed in. Those kind of hard woods is
Yeah.
what they really like.
It's funny you're saying that because that is so often when we have conversations about mushrooms, I don't quite realize the things that I'm seeing when I find mushrooms, but they often tick all the boxes that you're saying. And it's actually often I'm like there's an area where I've done some turkey hunting before, and it usually involves me going up or down very steep,
Hmm.
steep areas in like kind of slightly sandier earth, or those kinds of things. Yeah, yeah, it's funny.
Nice.
It's very
Well, when are
true.
you hunting turkeys? When's turkey hunting season?
That's a good point. Let me think. I'd have to look it up. It's
It's probably a
usually like March or April kind of time.
okay.
I found them then at that time. Maybe.
Okay.
I
So,
think it's around then. Yeah.
well,
Does that make sense?
the trumpets should be around at that time, especially
Yeah.
early March. Going into April can be a little bit of a far shot.
Mm-hmm.
I've only seen that really like last season. They were
Mm.
going well into April.
Well, it was last season. That was when I was finding them.
Uh-huh.
So maybe it was just like lucky that time.
Yeah, always
Yeah.
keep an eye out.
So is there do they have any other indicator mushrooms or anything like that, or
For
other
black
things to watch out for?
trumpets, um, no, for me, I'm not really seeing a lot of other stuff growing in with the black trumpet that would be sort of a signal to me. It's mostly the tan oak stands that you're looking
Yeah.
for.
Yeah,
And,
yeah.
obviously you can see those from pretty far away too. And a lot of the tan oak stands will be sort of a little bit hidden into the interior. So you might be hiking through a lot of like mixed forests, a lot of fir and maybe hemlock and stuff like that. And then all of a sudden you'll come across a bunch of tan oaks, and that's really what you're trying to get to. So from the trailhead or the road or whatever, it might, oh, that doesn't look that great for black trumpets. But once you start getting in there and penetrating that forest a little bit, you'll start to come across those stands a little bit more.
Ah, okay. I think we've like pretty much covered the black trumpets um, side of things, unless there's any other like nuances or tips or secrets you have for that type of mushroom.
No, I mean, it's a fun mushroom to hunt. You just got to go inland a little bit and just really look for those kind of environments and be prepared to have sore legs the next day because of those slopes. They will fruit on the tops of ridges and just along the belly of these ridges and stuff too. But, I've found that I tend to try to take the way that I think nobody else has taken, so I'll see those really steep, hard lines to go through. And it's like, you really don't want to do it, but I know that's where the mushrooms are going to be. So that's what I do. And I don't have a subscription to Gold's Gym. So that's my way of getting a workout.
That's
So
leg day.
yeah, exactly. Trumpets are hard work.
So what's the next usual suspect in the sequence after black trumpets then?
Yeah, so honestly, things are starting to taper off pretty good
Okay.
after the trumpets. So you're going into March and sometimes April, like we were talking about, and then next month is May and June. So it's like uh, at that point, I'm kind of changing. Um, I'm changing gears. That's like the down after the trumpets have come. That's kind of like a little bit of downtime, and I start changing my mentality towards um, higher elevation, towards like the Sierra, towards Mount Shasta area,
Hmm.
and that's an expectation of spring mushrooms coming in. So like morels and spring kings, they call them the porcinis that flush in the Sierra.
Okay.
Actually, there is one other mushroom that I almost forgot about that will pop up tail around black trumpet time and tail into black trumpet time too, and into the spring up in the higher elevations. But that's Matsutake.
Yes, I
So
was gonna ask.
the Matsutake, you can't forget about them. And that's a mushroom that, is like a deep winter mushroom. They like the cold to get them going, as
Okay.
opposed to like we were talking earlier with the porcini that like the warm to get them going.
So like a proper cold snap, you mean?
Yeah, they like the cold snaps. And
Okay.
and it usually around that time of year doesn't really start to warm up after they've flushed, sometimes a little bit, but it's okay for it to just like stay cold for a while. They like that, and it actually extends their season quite a bit. Bugs definitely like Matsutake too, so you don't want things to warm up too much. So yeah, that cold snap, they really dig that. And that's another mushroom that kind of requires a little bit more expertise. It's not really a beginning mushroom to hunt for. There are other lookalikes. You do have to go deeper usually to find that mushroom. Um, Similar situation as the black trumpets. They like that sandy soil. That's a big feature of that environment that you're looking for Matsutake. And they also like the hardwoods.
Okay.
So the tan oaks, the madrones, the manzanita, stuff like that. Sometimes in with pines, and but that's more again like higher elevation, Sierra, and they're going pretty good. Matsutake this season up in Shasta, they're up there right now. They've been up there for weeks. They're doing pretty good up there. But Matsutake in Japanese means pine mushroom,
Oh, does it?
and so, but a lot of people associate that with like, oh, I should be looking under the pines for that mushroom here. But that's Japanese. That's Japan. In Japan, they they flush with the pines. They don't really do that here in our area. They like the tan oaks. So it's a little bit misleading of a name for them, but mushrooms associate with different trees in different areas, sometimes from county to county, definitely from state to state, and definitely from country to country.
I've been looking for Matsutakis for a while.
Uh
And
huh.
many times I like think I found them and I have that excited moment and then I'm like, ah, no, this is not Matsutake. Um, but are there any indicator mushrooms? Because that would make my life so easy. If there was like, oh, okay, this is a clue about where they may be in the future.
Yeah, not really. Sometimes there's other mushrooms that you'll see in the general area, but um, there are sort of lookalikes. There's one called the cat's paw. There's a lot of like Russula that might be flushing at the
Yeah,
same
I think
time.
that's what I see.
Yeah, some of and those would a lot of those are like white capped mushrooms.
Hmm.
A lot of the growth of the Matsutake is also kind of happening under the ground. So with a lot of Matsutake hunting, you're looking for shrumps. You're looking for just little what my wife and I call duff muffins, where the ground is just pushed up a little bit.
Yeah,
But they do like sort of the open exposed areas where you can see a bit of the dirt, and they'll just be barely just pushing through. So that's why I don't really call that a beginner's mushroom. And
hmm,
they like those high, somebody once said, a really great hunter that I know once described Matsutakis as liking a view. And when I thought about some spots that I found Matsutake, uh, the situation is just that. It's usually like on top of a ridge or just on the side of a ridge, somewhere high up where there has been this really expansive, beautiful view right there, too.
interesting.
So, less so like down in the gullies, down in the valleys, down by the creek or the stream or whatever. They're going to be a little bit, they're going to be a lot more higher up, and they do like those views.
Yeah,
So
kind of
that can be,
regal, looking down on everyone else.
yeah, right. But maybe they deserve that title too. Is they are a pretty prized mushroom in some cultures, and even here, I heard that back in the day, not even that long ago, maybe the early or in the 90s, a lot of chefs didn't really know that mushroom here in the States, and I heard that mushroom was a really hard sale
Really?
to chefs because they didn't really know it. They didn't really know how to work with it or what it can be used for. But that is all since it's changed quite a bit. It's quite a prize mushroom to get, but it's also not everyone likes that mushroom. Texturally, it's a little bit different, and the fragrance is pretty strong
Yeah,
too.
I was going to ask. What is that really distinct smell? Like I've been lucky enough to smell, but I'm trying to remember how would you describe it?
A lot of the guides describe it as like a red hots, like the candy mixed with like a sweaty gym sock, and that doesn't sound appealing. And I've never really got that sweaty gym sock side of things. For me, it's more of a cinnamon. It's like when you take a good whiff of it, it almost kind of burns your nostril a little bit, like a cinnamon would do. And I find it quite a bit more pleasant than that description that you see a lot. And
Yeah.
that is a huge those other like the cat's paw and the russula and some of these other mushrooms that can be confused for the matsutake won't have that scent. So it's a big part of the ID and description of that mushroom is to get that nose, really stick your nose into it and take a good whiff of that. And if you're getting that and all the other it keys out in all the other regards, and that's what you've got.
Yeah. It's such a distinct smell, isn't it? I'm glad that I
Hmm.
have, even though I couldn't tell you exactly now what it smells like, I know if I smell one again, I'll be like, oh, that's the thing. It's kind of a pretty, yeah, it's distinct
Yeah,
odor, isn't
very
it?
distinct, very very unusual.
So, there's a, we kind of like moved into Matsutakis now, and I'm wondering because I feel like we may have like, and I could be wrong, but wonder if we've skipped a couple of possible.
Oh, there's tons of stuff we skip. Yeah.
Did we do chanterelles as well?
Oh, we I don't know. I don't think we did
I don't think we've done
chanterelles. No.
chanterelles.
So chanterelles, they kind of, they call them summer chanterelles when they're out in like in August,
Yeah.
and that's usually about the correct timing for summer chanterelles.
Okay.
And it's interesting because a lot of newbies get discouraged when more experienced hunters are finding chanterelles in August. Um, but they're definitely a thing in the summertime, and it could be quite warm. I've been sweating in a t-shirt hunting chanterelles before. So it's definitely a thing, and that's when they start around in August usually. And that's a slow growing mushroom, and there's several different types of chanterelles in our area that sort of flush in different times, and they all overlap. I've found three different kinds of chanterelles in the same area at the same time,
Yes.
and it is a slow growing mushroom. I think that the research that I was cued into early on was that it's, from pin to mush is somewhere around like 70 days,
Wow.
67 days, something like that was reported, but I've definitely seen that mushroom go for way longer than that. So it really depends on, these other things that we talked about with RH and the amount of rainfall and stuff, but they can kind of go and then kind of slow down. They can dry out a bit. They can keep going. They can get saturated, and sort of the end of the season, they'll turn into what a lot of pickers call mud puppies, where they're just like kind of, they've gone through the ringer, and they've had duff on them and dirt on them, and you're kind of prying them out of the earth, and they're just kind of wet
Yeah.
and heavy and a lot of dirt and mud on them and stuff. And but I much prefer the earlier in the season chanterelles where they're a bit more dry. They're like snappier. They're kind of crisp. You can really peel them like string cheese. They just have like
Yes.
this amazing texture to them. So yeah, we don't want to forget about chanterelles. It's one of the easier mushrooms to hunt because it's so loud in the forest
Mm-hmm.
as far as the color goes. They're a little bit more forgiving on the kind of forest that they like. They kind of like a mixed conifer around here. They kind of favor the fir a bit more, but they like the hemlock in there. There's some that like a little bit more oaky, so there'll be this that expand it. That's most of the forest out here. It's like
Yes.
these mixed fir and hemlock woodlands with maybe other conifers too, pines mixed in. So the kind of environment that chanterelles like is like really all over the place here. And that is a mushroom that will be like they will have these like long veins where you'll see just like, man, I've seen like 30, 40 foot runs of chanterelles before where they're literally right next to each other or within inches for that length. And so they'll be a little bit easier for people to find, and it's a hard one to like misidentify. So again, it's a great beginner mushroom for that.
Yes,
And that mushroom will go for a while,
for
you
long.
know. So there's last season I think was the longest running season I've seen it, and I want to say like eight plus months it was out. So pretty cool.
Wow, I found a lot of them quite early in the season as well. I think they were some of the first ones, if I remember correctly. Some of the first mushrooms that I found. I remember being excited because the seasons before had been a bit later, and we were moving, not moving, but like traveling over to South Africa.
Hmm.
So I was a little bit forlorn, thinking, "Oh, I'm going to miss the whole season." But
Right.
when it's like on the other side, I'm going to go and skip to the southern hemisphere and have like an extra summer. So
Yeah. Bonus.
you win some, you lose some. But the thing was, they were very young, and is there a time that they're in their prime? Like for me with the chanterelles, the ones that we found were very young, like they were just coming up,
Hmm.
but they were absolutely unblemished. There was, I think, I found a whole bunch of them, and only maybe one of them had a few little creepy crawlies living in them. The
Hmm.
rest were like perfect, and they
Yeah.
lasted a long time. Like we harvested a bunch, and they
Sure.
lasted very long in the fridge afterwards.
Yeah, that's a cool thing about the chanterelles is they don't really have, animals don't really like to eat them. Squirrels don't really like them. Deer don't really like them. And actually, bugs don't really like them. Even with the warm ups and the cool downs and all that stuff, it's not a real buggy mushroom.
Okay,
And that sort of like extends that aids towards them being around quite a bit longer too. As far as the prime time to pick them, I think it's just your own opinion on what you want or maybe what you want to do with them. Like, I harvest a lot of these early smaller buttons because I'll do a lot of pickling with them. It's one of my favorite, it is my favorite mushroom to pickle. And those young buttons that are really firm and dry and kind of snappy and they're kind of crunchy, even
yeah,
just being in the brine for the pickling, they'll still after weeks and months, they'll still have that quality to them,
nice.
and they fit nice in little jars and they look super cute. So, I'll pick a lot that are sort of in that young sort of button stage, but there's usually so many of them around. I might tend not to do that with a lot of mushrooms because you do want them to sporulate and produce and do their thing. But chanterelles are one of the most common mushrooms out there. They grow all over North America, all over Europe, Central America. They're just like they're almost everywhere. If you were to look at a map where chanterelles flush, it covers a lot more ground than a lot of other mushrooms do.
I like them probably because they're easy to find, and the amount of them.
Yeah, and
But they
they
taste
taste
so
great.
good. They
Yeah,
taste
they're
so
so
good as well.
dynamic. You can cook them all different kinds of ways. They are definitely at the top of the list for edibles for me.
Yeah, and maybe let's go through like the rest of the usual suspects. But if we have a bit of time at the end, maybe if you're up for it, you can talk about a little bit of the things that you like to do with the mushrooms. If there's any of them, like pickling, I'm so curious about pickling mushrooms. I've heard it for many different things, but never thought about it for wild mushrooms. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, I think, Italians have been doing it for a long time. Different antipasta that has these pickled buttons. I guess that maybe they're like some kind of an agaricus, like a cremini or something like that. I'm not sure. But it is kind of a rare thing to pickle them. I don't know a whole lot of people that do them. I think I'd consider them a delicacy.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's so many different edible mushrooms that are out and about, and some of them I've eaten and sort of decided, I don't really need to harvest that one again.
Okay.
There's stuff like shaggy manes will be around in midwinter too.
And the shaggy mane is, if I'm correct, that's also the inky cap. Is that right? The one that can, if you find it a bit too late, it has. Is that right?
Yeah, it does have that sort of uh that yeah, it does sort of like start to disintegrate and have that inky black stuff. There's another mushroom called the inky think it's the common name is the alcohol inky cap because you don't
Oh,
want to mix drinking alcohol. Like if you've drank alcohol the day before even and you have that mushroom, you'll have a really gnarly reaction.
like
So there's
like in the
that as
bathroom or like tripping out.
no, not tripping, just like stomach upset.
Okay.
And I've heard it's quite painful too.
Oh,
But that's a really it is edible mushroom, but it's a really delicate one to collect. So are the shaggy manes for that matter. You usually want to have like a separate bag or just, I only will collect that. I love that mushroom. It's great. Talking about recipes, as like a stroganoff mushroom, it has a really deep, rich, mushroomy flavor to it and nice color too. So I love it as like a mushroom and stroganoff. But it's a really like that mushroom. It's like you kind of have to eat it that night, that evening, or the next day. After that, it just really starts to melt basically in your fridge.
yeah.
So you really want to get on that one pretty quick.
Oh, I would totally agree. I think the first time I found a bunch, um, yeah, I put them in a little box in my backpack, and I think even just getting home, they had deteriorated quite a lot. It's amazing how they just almost liquefy.
Yeah,
It's
it's
pretty wild.
yeah. You don't want to mix it in with that other mushrooms too. If you're picking,
Yeah.
say, hedgehogs or something at the same time, and you set those things in with the hedgehogs, it's just going to be a real big mess by the time. So actually, a box is a good idea because it's sturdy. They won't get crushed in your pack. Um,
Yes. Good point.
but that's a good one.
And then, okay, I've got to ask because it's one of my favorites, but I don't know, maybe it's not popular for most people, but lobsters. There's been an early kind of summer lobster season this year, but that's not always the case, is it?
Not always. Up until I'd say actually up until last year, I would normally go north to hunt lobsters. I'd hunt them up in like Humboldt County. They really love the spruce trees up in Humboldt
Okay.
and some other conifers too, but I was finding them heavy under the spruce trees up there. And we don't have a lot of spruce here. And they aren't really with the spruce here. They do like sort of a mixed conifer forest, pines and firs and stuff like that here. But that is a really fun mushroom to hunt. They're so beautiful, so vibrant. I'm not the biggest fan of how they taste.
Okay.
Some people kind of love them. Some people just can't do them at all. But and even some of the texture I don't even really care for. But I will sort of prep them in certain ways to suit my needs where I will find them enjoyable. But I don't eat a lot of lobsters every season. But I do love hunting that mushroom. It's a cool one because it starts off as uh, Russula brevipies. It's a white Russula mushroom, the short stalk mushroom or
Yeah.
short stalk Russula. And there's this sort of like a fungus that likes to travel by air, airborne fungus called hypermyces that takes over that Russula mushroom and changes it into a totally new mushroom. So it's like this crazy mushroom magic that happens
Yeah.
that changes the structural integrity, makes it bigger and more prouder, changes the shape into all this crazy different monstrous shapes. Of course, it adds that color to the exterior,
It's like way
and
denser as well, isn't it?
it's
Often.
yeah, it makes it a lot denser. And the short stalk Russula by name suggests that it's really short to the ground, and so you may not see that mushroom as Russula brevipies in the forest, but when it gets taken over by the hypomyces, it makes it much more proud and sticks, that pushes through the duff and just charges away. And as a lobster, that mushroom can just get so huge.
Yeah.
And yeah, so they're actually, probably tail end of them. They're still out there. You can find those right now. So we're in early October. But I've started finding maybe my first lobsters a couple months ago almost
Hmm.
here. And it's been a pretty good year for them this year, but not as good as last year. Last year was crazy. You don't want to pick that mushroom too old. If it's I really like picking just the really hard, firm specimens. If it's spongy at all, or darker red. It kind of turns into like a darker red or almost magenta, and then the nose on it changes quite a bit too, where it does kind of get this funky seafoody kind of aroma. But I will hunt them in that stage too, because at that point, and all stages of the lobster is a great mushroom for natural dye, so
Ah,
people will dye yarns and make different things with it. And there's a whole spectrum of colors that you can get from the lobster mushroom. And they're more pronounced if you're using the older specimens that have gotten really funky and nasty and gotten that darker magenta color. So it's kind of a different part of the game for mushroom hunting, a
yeah, it's
whole
good.
other facet that I do, that I focus on not only the edible culinary side of things for fungi, but I also get into various dye mushrooms, and the dye mushrooms in later stages as opposed to edible mushrooms in their early or prime stages are choice. For dye mushrooms, it's usually the later stage of the mushroom as they're like dying and going out that are much better to use as dye mushrooms.
So it's kind of like a win-win in that scenario then with a lobster. You either find it fresh and plump and young and firm, and or if it's running a bit late, then you it's perfect for the other purpose of dyeing.
Yeah,
That's great. So
exactly.
I'd love to in a second duck into a bit more information about the dyeing mushroom side of things, but
Sure.
I'd love to just with the lobster stuff, just like go through a
Mhm.
couple of these things in terms of surrounding vegetation, like topography, and I guess really what you're doing is looking for the original russula that becomes infected with is it the hypomyces? Is that the
Yes.
right term?
Uh-huh.
So it's like, how do we find lobsters then? Do they, or I guess the original host mushroom, where do they normally hang out?
They like a mixed forest too. They like the firs, they like pines. Some of the best spots that I've found them are maybe a little bit heavier on the pine side with the firs and hemlocks mixed in.
Okay.
There's usually a lot of like ferns around,
Yes.
and good, you know, obviously the indicator mushroom to a lobster is the Russula brevipies. So, and you'll see those before the lobsters, before they get sort of taken over by the hypermyces. So if you're finding the short stalk Russula around, it is edible in that state. So you can harvest it in that state and eat it if you want. It's not a choice mushroom in my eyes, but you can also just log that spot in your mind, or however you do, and go back to it weeks later and look for the lobster mushroom at that point.
Hmm.
um but as a lobster, it's much easier to find.
Yes.
But you will come across the russula from time to time in different zones, and just make that note to come back to that area.
Yeah, that makes absolute sense, man. And it's funny. I think you mentioned before, briefly when we were talking in passing about lobsters, that they don't usually have like specific vein shapes or anything like that. They're often quite individual mushrooms or like just in a little group. But I got to
Right.
say, like
Uh-huh.
the few that I've found have been in long, like very thick, like stripe, or a few different kind of shapes like that. It's been interesting. I don't know. Yeah,
Uh-huh.
I mean, I guess this
Yeah,
this probably sounds unconventional. I guess.
yeah, it's might be a little bit rare to find them in a vein like that for super long. Like I said, this season I did find myself in a fairy ring of lobster mushrooms, and that was pretty. I think that was maybe a first for me.
Yeah,
But usually they are sort of scattered around, just isolated here and there.
I think that's pretty much. If there's any other like nuances of finding those lobsters, then jump in. But otherwise, I'd love to talk to you more about dyeing mushrooms is it's an interesting
Mm.
because obviously eating mushrooms is the first thing that springs to my mind. But if there's a whole world of dyeing mushrooms, if you could give like a quick whirlwind touch on that.
Sure. Yeah, so not, not all most mushroom hunters I know aren't picking mushrooms for dye. A lot of them aren't even picking the medicinal. They're just after the culinary side of things. And the more dynamic you could be as a hunter, the more mushrooms variety that you can know and understand. More mushrooms you're picking for me, the happier I am. So it was just the sort of next stage for me was to broaden the scope of mushrooms to look for and mushrooms to find. And I also noticed that a lot of other mushroom hunters weren't picking mushrooms for dye baths. And then, so I kind of started getting into it a little bit here and there. And, the Mendocino Coast Mushroom Club that I'm part of out here, we did a couple demonstrations where, the whole mushroom dye phenomenon started right here in Mendocino with a couple women here, Miriam Rice, and I'm sure I'm forgetting a couple other names, but it all started here. The experimentation with them, the early sort of like handmade zines that were like describing the different mushrooms and the different colors, and then eventually the book that Miriam did was showing the different results that you can get, and you're basically like mixing different mordants, different boil times, and different pHs of the water in conjunction with the fresh or dried mushroom to get so many different results.
Interesting.
Yeah, so it's really cool. And then I guess a few individuals that noticed that I was kind of getting into hunting the dye mushrooms kind of like sort of took me under their wing, and because these are natural dye artists that are usually dyeing yarn and making socks or sweaters or hats and stuff, and a lot of people into that sort of thing. Maybe not so much now, but in earlier days were kind of a little bit older folks that maybe weren't getting out into the woods as much. So they started kind of leaning on me, somebody that was out there in the woods hunting all mushrooms, and they were all of a sudden they were just kind of putting their orders in. If
Oh,
you ever come across, Cortnaria smithii, let me know. And they'd be giving me these different lists, or you ever or sending me pictures. Have you ever seen this mushroom out there? And then I'd look it up and find out yay or nay if it was in our area or if I had seen it before. And a lot of the dye mushrooms too are a bit harder to hunt than a lot of the edibles. They're either flash in the pan fruitings, or they're just like really weird little areas, or off just different timings, or stuff that you would bypass just unintentionally while looking for other edibles. They're also, besides the lobster, maybe like a little bit less noticeable. So um, it took a second to kind of like figure out what was out in my area and what were fruiting in large numbers and what were more rare. Most really good dye mushrooms are kind of rare, especially the really sought after ones that get like blue colors or red colors. Those are really kind of cherished
yeah.
uh, colors to get in nature. And so I was just kind of like getting in deeper with the folks that were creating stuff, with different yarns and textiles that they were dyeing that were kind of informing me a little bit deeper. I did pick up a couple different mushroom dye books and educated myself that way, but mostly it's been working with individuals that are, and it's a big thing now. There's a lot of demonstrations, a lot of people that travel to different mushroom clubs and different areas of the country that do demonstrations using these mushrooms. So it was just a way for me to expand upon what else I can get out there. And actually, a lot of them are quite valuable too.
Yeah.
Some of the most um, valuable mushrooms that I hunt are dye mushrooms.
Really?
And it's cool because a lot of the other hunters aren't looking for them, or they're kicking them, or they're just bypassing them. I'll be hunting literally the same woods with another friend hunter, or small groups of other hunters, and they're just going after the sort of the same old edibles, and that's great. But I'm like focusing in on the whole set of different mushrooms that might be in that area, and they don't really seem to care. Maybe they just don't know. Maybe it's less exciting for them to pick mushrooms that you can't eat. But for me, it's a win-win. And then the tail end of that is seeing the creations that these artists make with the mushrooms that I find. I mean, I've got knit socks and stuff like that um, some of these artists have made for me from the mushrooms that I picked for
That's
them.
cool.
And to see that circle, and also being an artist myself, just I can really, really appreciate that. And it really grounds everything in this really particular way that I think is really special.
Yeah.
So it just it really gets me fired up when some of those dye mushrooms are out there.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's cool. I mean, to be honest, I've been aware of mushroom dyeing, or like taking dyes from mushrooms loosely, but I had no idea that this is where it kind of really got momentum in this area that we're kind of picking right now. So that's
Yeah,
cool.
Mendocino, that's where it started.
And then also, if people are curious about finding more information about dyeing, I'm sure that there are great books. You mentioned one book that your friend wrote, I think. Is that correct? Like,
Uh-huh.
we can put a link in the show notes and everything.
Yeah, let's do that. Yeah,
Okay,
there's different websites and Facebook groups and books that are out there.
Okay, fantastic. So I think, unless there's any other mushrooms which you feel like we've missed off the list of the usual suspects, you sent me a very helpful list of questions that people most often ask you.
Uh-huh.
And that, like, we could just do like run through some of those and answer some of those questions. That'd be good. But if are there any other mushrooms that you think that we are worth mentioning?
I'm sure there's stuff that we're missing. There's so many out there, maybe just real quick,
Yeah.
oyster mushrooms.
Yes. Good point.
That's a mushroom that you can find. I've found it all 12 months of the year out here. That is another mushroom that you get into the whole microclimate hunting of things, where they
Hmm.
like these damper areas. They like along like creeks and streams and rivers, and they really love the alder trees out here.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
dead, dying, diseased alder trees. If you see alders that have fallen down over a creek or something like that, that's always a really good spot to look for them. It's an easy mushroom to ID too, and to not mistake as a beginner. And sometimes these logs will just be totally covered in this mushroom, so you can have like a 15-40 pound haul off of one log.
Yeah.
So that's pretty exciting. It's a good mushroom for people to know about. It's a good edible too. I like it better than the cultivated oyster mushrooms as well.
Okay.
But yeah, I'm sure there's stuff that we're gonna miss, but we'll probably be here all day if we get into
Yeah,
everything.
that's true.
So I like the idea of moving on to some of these other
Yes.
questions that I get hit with a lot.
Yeah, yeah. I've got to say, with those oysters, you made me think of that was some of the first mushrooms that I started hunting for, and
Mm.
so many times now. It actually happened to me this week, and I was out and we were looking for lobsters because my friend had found a bunch in an area, and we were going back to just do a more thorough check.
Mm-hmm.
But I did see a dead alder with a bunch of oysters on. But so often you'll see a dead alder, which is like half the top half is snapped off, and then there's
Mm-hmm.
it's just a forest of these oysters growing up. But sometimes they're just too high. They're like,
Yeah.
it happened to me where it was probably 10 feet up in the air, maybe 8 feet up in the air. I could reach up and grab like a few of them. It was on a pretty steep slope, but I just get so teased by those.
Yeah. I mean, if there's a will, there's a way. There's different techniques. Some people will tie their knife to a long stick and kind of cut them, and then they fall down, they catch them in their hat. I've done the hat trick thing so many times. sometimes, it's a little bit of a risk because they could get damaged, but sometimes you can just push that rotten tree over.
True.
A little bit dangerous. So make sure you can do it in kind of a safe way. But I've done that before too. Um, but yeah, sometimes it's a little bit frustrating. Sometimes you just gotta let them spore on. Hmm.
So I think we've covered a couple of these questions already with the things we talked about today, but the third one on my list here is like, should I be afraid of poisonous or toxic lookalikes? Is a question. What's your take on this?
Um, I think like a healthy awareness and maybe a little bit of just like healthily being, quote unquote, afraid is good because we don't want to get too loose and just like, oh, I think it's this mushroom. I'm gonna go for it. You want to be 100% on your idea of anything that you're gonna consume. But there is a lot of like fear around a lot of toxic mushrooms as far as like, people thinking they can't touch them. They don't even want to look at them. They don't want to handle them. They don't want to mix them in by mistake with other mushrooms. And you can handle any, even the most poisonous mushrooms. You can still handle them. And all of them too, you can actually take a little nibble of if you want and chew it up, taste it. You just don't want to swallow it.
Okay.
And sometimes for mushrooms, that is part of the IDing process, is taking a little nibble of it to see what it tastes like, especially the Rustula species.
Mm.
Um, if it tastes like bitter or peppery, spicy on the tip of your tongue, then it's not an edible Rustula. The ones that are more pleasant and mild in taste, so you can axe out a lot of. It's such a dynamic. There's so many mushrooms in that group that you can really thin them out through a simple taste test. So even the most poisonous
Interesting.
mushrooms, you can taste them even. Just don't swallow them because you don't want them to go through your livers and kidneys and get into your bloodstream. So yeah, I think a healthy fear is a good thing, but don't let it discourage you from getting into mushrooming, to getting into picking mushrooms. It just there's really just like a handful out here that you should be aware of and what they look like and what they like to grow on. um and just like a healthy awareness is obviously, you want to know the poisonous almost as well as the edibles.
Yeah. Yeah.
So so but you don't need to fear them too drastically. Like, if you pick one by mistake, it's in your basket, you figure it out later because maybe you had a question on that ID and you ID it at home. It's okay if it touched your candy caps. um you just don't want to consume it by all means necessary. And if you don't know, if you've got no one to ask, or you're not, join the California Mushroom Identification Group, and Facebook is a great place to ask ID questions. Not all groups are the best place to ask IDs. A lot of just your local chapters might not be the best. But a lot of the experts are in those mushroom ID groups, and a lot of people respond fast because sometimes it is a case where somebody ingested them and they need to know really
Yes.
fast, like
Yeah.
what happened, so they can react to that. Um, so, but yeah, for the most part, it's like those handful of mushrooms that instill the fear and get people to say, "Oh yeah, but you need to know which ones." And I don't get into mushroom hunting because I don't want to eat the wrong one, but it's just like fruits or vegetables or there's so many more poisonous plants out there. But
Hmm.
people are going out and picking berries and picking watercress and all the other edible plants that are out there. And there doesn't seem to be as big of a concern with the plants, but there's way more poisonous plants than there
Mm.
are mushrooms out there.
Oh, it's a good point. There's like much less stigma for some reason. Yeah, that's
Mhm.
so interesting. Okay, so I've got a couple more questions. Well, I've got a few more questions, but the next two questions kind of I think fit together quite nicely. So another common question you get, like, is it okay to hunt mushrooms by myself, or should I always have a partner with me? And then there's a kind of a follow up to that is, and maybe a Brucey bonus of that is, can you find more mushrooms when you're in larger groups or solo?
Hmm. Yeah, so I would encourage most people that are just kind of starting out to have a partner to go out with. It is way more safer to have somebody to have your back and kind of be there in case something happens. Sometimes too, it takes a lot of the fear factor out for people. Like if you're not experienced in the woods and you're by yourself, there could be quite a bit of anxiety attached to the experience, and you really want it to be as pleasurable as possible. So sometimes having somebody with you just to have maybe a light conversation along the way, or just to keep things a little bit lighter. Maybe if you're talking with somebody in the woods, there's less chance of stumbling upon some kind of a predator like a bear or a lion in our area. So, the solo hunting, the solo deep woods hunting is more for an experienced woodman or woodswoman. The larger group thing, I do take small groups and large groups out sometimes. Most of those scenarios, especially the large groups, we're not going super deep into the woods. I do have to keep a tally on people. So, but it's kind of a double-edged sword. Some of the time, like when you're going out with more people, you can definitely cover more ground and see more area, and you might have a better um, success rate as far as finding mushrooms that you want. But for me, sometimes being out with groups of people takes me out of this particular hunting zone, this mindset and framework in my head of what I'm putting together as I'm scanning the area and going through different areas of the forest where I'm maybe thinking, getting distracted by other people's finds or where other people are and stuff like that. It'll take me out of the zone. I feel like I'm most successful going by myself and just getting into the zone, or going out with another experienced hunter that I know I don't have to worry about. Most of the time, we stay within earshot. We're giving out hoots every once in a while. There's all these different sort of calls that the more experienced hunters do to each other to kind of let each other know this, either this is where I am, or hey, I just found something, or hey, there's more, there's a lot more mushrooms over here. There's sort of these different calls that we use. And it's a good way to sort of navigate in the woods too, to like, oh, I might draw my buddy in a little. He's not having any luck over there. She's not having any luck over there, and I'm giving like, kind of a little bit more excited hoots out. And so they're picking up that, oh, Billy's finding stuff over there. I'm not finding much over here. Maybe I should start walking a little bit more in that direction. And not even specifically in the same spot that I am. Maybe it's just the general area. Maybe the trees are better over in
Yeah,
there. So you
yeah.
can kind of use this uh, teamwork cooperation with even just one extra person to be able to slowly zone in on areas where the mushrooms are. That's a big part of like figuring out where they are, especially like morels and all mushrooms. But a lot like the morel hunting is that it's like going in, staying within earshot, throwing out different calls to zero in and start finding where the big flushes are.
So when you say hoots, I'm sure this is very obvious to a lot of people, but do you mean like an owl hoot?
Yeah, sort of like that. Or sometimes it's a whistle. Like it's funny, different people that I go out with, I just know they use different calls, so I'll kind of use the calls that they use. With my wife, when it's just her and I give kind of like hopefully this isn't sexist or anything, but kind of like a pretty girl whistle, like a something like that. That means I've found something. Oh, my dog just jumped down when I did that. So
It's
that's telling her that I found a mushroom, but if I do that twice, that means, I'm finding mushrooms. And if I do that 3 times, that's telling her, get over here. I need backup. So it just kind of depends on who I'm hunting with, and it could be kind of a light thing. Sometimes it is the actual hool, or owl hoot, just whatever works.
okay. So you also mentioned two things, and they are often kind of discussed things. One is about mushrooms and their proximity to like busy roads and traffic pollution and what's considered a safe mushroom to eat, what's not a safe mushroom. It'd be great if you could just reflect on your thoughts on that and that what the general consensus is for that kind of stuff.
Okay. Yeah, mushrooms have a tendency to like sides of roads, sides of paths and trails. And sometimes there is pollution in that same area, whether it's, exhaust from logging trucks or whatever it is. Mushrooms have a really good way of like breaking down a lot of those toxic elements before they uptake them into their fruiting body. So I'm not super concerned with roadside porcinis or roadside amanitas or a lot of mushrooms that grow right off of trails and roads.
Okay,
Definitely,
interesting.
if you definitely want to wash everything that you bring home and stuff. Anyway, but some people won't pick stuff roadside, and a general foraging rule of thumb is that you don't harvest anything within like 15 feet of the road. So berries or flowers or whatever. I mean, you're not supposed to harvest wild flowers, but there's different herbs and maybe St. John's wort and stuff like that, berries, etc. You just, you know it's nice to kind of leave some stuff too for people to also experience as they're traveling along their way. It's like, oh, look at that. Those berries are going off over there, or flowers, or most like good choice edible mushrooms like porcinis that love roadsides probably aren't going to last too long. Like if you're a person that says nay to that, the next person is going to say yay to that. So, but I don't, I'm maybe a little bit more concerned with like maybe mushrooms growing in like landscaped areas where maybe people might be spraying with something, god forbid, a roundup or something dumb like that.
Mm,
Maybe stuff that could be sprayed onto the mushroom topically where it's not really um uptaking anything. It's actually been sprayed onto the mushroom. But those kind of windows, mushrooms kind of come and go pretty quick, and windows for that kind of stuff happening, you just have to make an on-site call at that point. But for the most part, I think it's safe to harvest roadside mushrooms and trailside mushrooms. Just be smart about it. If it looks like an old dump site or something like that, and I've seen that in the woods too, old maybe like trimmers camps and stuff in the woods where it's just a darn mess in there, and there's hedgehogs all over that spot, or I'll just pass on that kind of stuff. There's other places, or there's other, but uh, mushrooms grow and rich soils, diverse soils, places where there's nutrients, and people sometimes find volunteer mushrooms in their gardens, and they freak out that there's this weird white or brown mushroom next to their kale, and it's actually a sign that the soil is really good, that
mm.
there's beneficial nematodes, and maybe there's mycelium in there that's working in conjunction with the roots of some of the things that you're growing in there. It's a good sign generally to see mushrooms growing in various different substrates. They have a tendency to not grow in like um, poor poorly enriched soils and environments where the other trees and shrubs and plants are not thriving, they probably also won't thrive, but sometimes they actually do thrive in those kind of situations too. They're opportunists, and different mushrooms thrive on different things and different foods. So it really kind of depends, but just use your best judgment as to what is in the immediate area of that mushroom. But I've never felt any ill effects from harvesting a porcini roadside before.
No, it's good to get that input because there's always a lot of debate back and forth about things like that.
Mm-hmm.
There is also often a lot of debate and conversation about the ethics of mushroom harvesting, which is something that I know that you wanted to talk about today. So, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think having these two podcasts that we've done so far together, it's it's really hard to have the conversation in totality without bringing this subject into the mix. I think it's a responsible thing to do, and there are all different kinds of sides of it, ranging from cut versus pluck, how many mushrooms to leave behind, that kind of stuff. The kind of hunter that I am, I'm not really a casual hunter. I usually go pretty big, like we were talking earlier. If I know the mushrooms are out and flushing, I'm out there as much as I can, day after day, going into zones where I'm finding them, harvesting, going back the next day, pushing that area out, going deeper and deeper. And, a big part of why I do that is because I have multiple outlets for selling, trading, gifting these mushrooms.
Hmm.
I'm not going in there and harvesting 50 pounds of a particular mushroom, bringing them home, eating 15 pounds of them, and then the rest are going bad or something like that. That's just not happening in my world at all.
Yeah.
Um, and I'm getting so much joy and love back from the people that I share mushrooms for. And if I think I can't, sell them or trade them, then I often gift them. I often gift them anyway. I'll just walk them down to my neighbors, toss them in their mailboxes. They all know who they came from. Um, so it's really, there's different mushrooms that will flush in really large numbers. And black trumpets, let's use trumpets as an example. I've gone in and harvested 60 to 75 pounds of black trumpets in one hunt, you know.
That's so much.
And sometimes, I'll display or take shots of them and post them in some of these different mushroom groups that I'm in. And sometimes I'll get slack from people, they'll say stuff like, why are you harvesting all those? You'll never be able to eat them, or you have to leave some for the creatures and some to sporulate and all that. And I agree with that mentality, and I understand why people's mindsets go there. You want to let mushrooms sporulate. You want to let them keep doing their thing. With the case of black trumpets, it's a hard mushroom to hunt. They like dark areas and some of the other situations that we talked about earlier, the steep slopes and stuff like that. Even when they're all over the place, when they're just carpeting the forest floor, there's so many that you're not seeing. There's so many that are under the duff, that are under logs, that are behind trees that you didn't walk around. They're just all over the place. It's actually impossible to harvest every fruiting body from a particular area, even if you're walking out with big hauls like I sometimes do and other hunters do. So those mushrooms are getting a chance to do that. And like I said, I'm not taking anything that I know I can't find a home for, or I know I can't do something with. A lot of people will use the analogy of like an apple tree, that if the apple tree puts out these apples, um, if you're not doing any harm and picking all the apples from that tree, it's not going to prevent it from fruiting the next year. And in some cases with mushrooms too, um, and and I've noticed it for things like black trumpets and chanterelles, for instance, where when you're doing that act of plucking or cutting and stimulating that mycelium, it does just that. It does stimulate the mycelium, and sometimes it'll keep growing. Sometimes it'll induce like a second flush. Um, mushrooms like porcinis, where they're just here and there. It's obviously, if you take the only three porcinis that are in that area that you see, you're taking every mushroom in sight. But there are other mushrooms that are still coming up. That mycelium is still super healthy, and you're not doing anything to harm the future of that porcini to flush again in that area. If you're finding bigger, older specimens, so bigger, older specimens for porcinis, if there's something that's still worth harvesting that doesn't have a ton of bugs in it, we call those dryers. So a bigger porcini, it's kind of aged, it's got a lot of pores. That mushroom in that particular state is better as a dried mushroom. You don't really want to slice that thing up and cook it. It's going to have a lot of moisture in it. The pore set is going to be really big and thick, and it might be like a little bit mushy in the skillet. Those kind of mushrooms you could harvest and dry, but if they're bigger, if they're really blasted out and really buggy, you just want to let that thing spore on and
Mm.
just keep throwing spores out and just let it do its thing. So you're assessing every mushroom individually, and you're assessing every scenario where there might be large amounts of mushrooms individually. Um, if you want to leave every other mushroom or every fourth mushroom or something like that, by all means, like, do it. But it's not really harming anything by taking most or all that you see, because there's so much more that you're not seeing.
Yeah.
And so if a mushroom just looks like old and in the way, just let it spore on and do its thing. So
Yeah.
hunters that are bringing home big bounties like that, some we get a lot of slack from people sometimes, and I do like to leave mushrooms for sure, and I do it all the time, and even just like buttons and small stuff that's not really there yet. I'm not really A lot of times I'm not really concerned about going back to it to pick it when it's prime or bigger. I'll just say, that I'm just going to let that one go, let it get bigger, and just let it do its thing for the season. I don't have to come back and pick it when it's prime. Um, so yeah, that's sort of my take on it. There's always going to be somebody that's not going to have the same viewpoint as me on the situation. But as being somebody that's been in the woods season after season and has picked the same patches season after season, and not seeing uh, uh, degradation to these patches in any way, and oftentimes seeing them bigger the next year, there's not enough science and there's not enough real hard evidence to suggest that picking every mushroom is a bad idea,
Yeah.
period.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. Well, Billy, thank you for sharing all of your time and expertise on all of these different things today. Like we've really covered off a
Yeah.
lot of stuff in this area. So
Yeah,
yeah, that
thanks
was that
so
was amazing.
much. I really appreciate it. And there's so many different sort of levels and stages that you can be as a mushroom hunter. You don't have to like go for all these big bounties. Just getting enough for dinner, enough to share for friends, for the meal that you have planned is great. I've got friends that are avid mushroom hunters that don't like the taste of mushrooms, that don't like the texture, that don't like to eat them, but they're some of the best mushroom hunters I know.
So I asked this last time as well, but you've clearly got a huge wealth of knowledge. How can people follow your adventures and see what you're up to out in the woods?
Yeah, I guess mostly my online presence is going to be through Instagram at Billy Sprague, and I post a lot of just everything. Like I'm an artist and craftsman, and uh, grow food and hunt food and stuff. So there's a little bit of everything on there, and I'm also on Facebook, um, and I'm active participant in a lot of different mushroom groups, not only in our area but other places too. But any of the local, like the Mendocino Coastal Mushroom Club Facebook group, Forage Mendocino, I'm on there posting a lot too. Those are great little immediate communities where you can see what I'm up to and ask questions and engage and learn. Um, and I will have, I guess, a link to also to my wife's and my website.
Yeah,
We've got a little business called Born Free Natural Mystic that covers a lot of different interests that we do. A lot of mushrooms. I make mushroom knives. So yeah, I'm out there. I'm approachable. You could ask me anything, and if I can answer it, I will. If I can't, I can direct you someplace where it can be.
amazing. Well,
Thanks so
thanks,
much,
Billy.
Robin. Yeah,
Yeah, that was amazing. Such a detailed amount of information. But yeah, I'm sure if at some point in the future there'll be some other aspects of the mushroom world that I can pick your brains about, I would love to have you back on the show.
sure. There's other facets that we can dive into for sure. It's such a dynamic world, the mushroom world. There's so many things uh, going on, people healing themselves and with cancer and abuse, and just there's so much to the fungi world that we really can just keep this conversation going in whatever way you want to. I'm open.
Great. That concludes this episode, but I look forward to the next one. Thank-
Likewise, brother. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Billy. Okay. That's another episode sauteed and ready for the risotto. I want to thank Billy again for being such an open book. It continues to blow my mind how many experts have been willing to share their secrets from the wild, and long may it continue. If you've enjoyed this treasure trove of information and any of the other episodes you've listened to, then please feel free to share it with someone who you think would enjoy it. That's all from me for now. Thanks for listening, and until next time.